right now is on international solidarity, and particularly Palestine solidarity movement. And that's something that Joe is going to be talking about today after I'm finished. If you look at, and I'm sure almost all of us have been part of organizations that have been investigated by the FBI, and I could do my list, everything from the People Against Racism, which probably most people haven't heard of. We were an anti-racist group that organized in the late 60s in the white community, so you can imagine how well that worked out. To SDS, to Young Socialist Alliance, to Irish Northern Aid, and now the Palestine Solidarity Group that I'm a part of has had 6, 7 current and former members, not me, subpoenaed by this grand jury. So all of you have probably been in organizations that the FBI has been involved in one way or another. Well, if you go back and look at the history, one of the things that's important to remember is that the FBI was founded to repress political diversity in the United States. I mean, that was its primary function. And if you look at it through history, every once in a while they got distracted with, organized crime or whatever, but their purpose is to be a internal police force. So when they were founded around the World War I period, the main focus during that period of time really was on repression of, number one, anti-war movement, the anti-war movement, and there was one in the United States during World War I, and the labor movement. So many of the acts, like the Sedition Act and so on, that were passed during that time, focused on people who were against the U.S. participation in World War I. Well, who were many of those people? Well, socialists, clearly, and one of the largest groups was the Industrial Workers of the World, which many people are familiar with. There were some 400, IWW halls that were raided. Most of their members ended up going to jail for 20 years. Their leaders actually went to jail for about 20 years. That was really the focus there. And again, this is something I want to kind of remind you of as we go along. The theme of the attacks on social movements have a lot to do with solidarity movements. The one thing that the FBI and the U.S. Justice Department does not want to see, and this is the first example of that, is a labor movement that's participating in an anti-war movement. And you'll hear about that as we talk about today's repression of the anti-war movement. If you start going after World War I and approaching the World War II period, well, during World War II, there was there was a Smith Act that really talked about people who were subversives. Well, again, who did they focus on during that time? Labor groups, socialist groups, anyone who was against any type of war, organizing labor, or so on. And in fact, actually, even before World War II got started, the FBI had a whole series of investigations of people in various industries. The steel industry and public government, agencies, students, and so on. Any trade union was up for grabs. And during that period of time, it was mainly the Socialist Workers' Party who was targeted. And just like the IWW, all of their members at that time had 10-year jail terms. So if you look at that period of time around World War II, again, it's all about being anti-war, but clearly it's all about attacking the labor movement, right? Well, once you get after World War II, you have people like Truman, and I'm not going to go into detail about this. Everybody knows about the Red Scare. And Truman, passed executive orders that said that we really want to target these anarchist classes. Well, who were the anarchist classes? How about anti-war, trade unionists? Again, you had the same group of people that were targeted. During that period of time, that's when you had the acts that led to the McCarthy hearings, and obviously people who were supposed communist organizations and so on had to register. So everybody's pretty familiar, I think, with that period of time, so I'm not going to go into that. When you start moving to the civil rights era, and certainly there's been plenty talked about Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and so on being targeted by the FBI. But many times people don't know that even before that, the FBI had this file called Racial Matters. This was like, in the 50s. So it was pretty much anybody who had anything to do with, racial justice or suggested that, we might want to do something for, black people in the country and so on. So then Martin Luther King certainly came along, and then that's when the FBI launched what they called ComInfil. And just from the name, I love their little titles for things. What did that mean? Communist infiltration. So it allowed the FBI to have surveillance, to have disruptive techniques for any organization that maybe was influenced by the communists or the Communist Party. So a lot of people know that the focus of the FBI investigation of Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, very personal. They followed him around, they had tapes and all that type of thing. But often what gets lost in the history is coming back again to this. The FBI doesn't want to see groups that are going to be in solidarity with each other. So one of the things that happened during the Martin Luther King period is that he and his movement made overtures to the labor movement. There was a period of time when he tried to form an alliance with the Teamsters. So what do you think the FBI did? They submitted some false propaganda to Jimmy Hoffa at the time and so on, completely undermined that alliance, pretty much suggesting, Martin Luther King, is a bunch of communists and you want to be associated with them, blah, 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 blah. And of course, I think most people know that the spot where in Memphis, where Martin Luther King was assassinated, he was there to support the Memphis sanitation workers strike, along with practically every trade union group, student group, church group that was in Memphis was also supporting that strike. Well, what did the FBI do? You can read memos from J. Edgar Hoover just flipping out, and they sent tons of FBI agents, infiltrators, again, not just in Martin Luther King's organization, but student groups, anyone who was involved in that labor movement. The other thing that, of course, most of us know is that near the end of his life, Martin Luther King gave a very powerful speech that kind of suggested that he might join the anti-Vietnam War movement. Again, the last thing the FBI and the U.S. Justice Department wanted to see. So what did they do? They undermined him as much as possible and so on. So one of the questions that's always asked, of course, is, and I know everybody here is, smart enough to know that it doesn't really matter whether there's a Democratic president in power or a Republican in power. This activity just goes on. And during this period of time, this was when JFK and Lyndon Johnson were in power. So, okay, they're liberals and everything else, but I mean, why would they allow J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI, as an example, if you're Lyndon Johnson, allow them to attack a civil rights movement that you are trying to build support for? You're trying to pass a Civil Rights Act and so on, and even JFK was trying to do some of that. Why would they do that? Well, if you look at a lot of the records at the time, they got a lot of benefit on keeping track of what Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement was doing, what they were up to, right? Because the last thing Johnson wanted was, well, maybe the FBI might come up with something. Maybe Martin Luther King really is a communist, and maybe those Southern Democrats that I want to get to support my civil rights bill, that ain't going to happen. The other thing, and many people know Ramsey Clark, very liberal, he's involved in a lot of good causes. Well, he was the Attorney General under Lyndon Johnson at that time. And one of the things he did, he started a whole program to do surveillance on the ghettos, the largest cities in the United States, Chicago, New York, LA, and so on, to see if he could predict when the next, ghetto uprising would happen, right? Because Johnson kind of thought, well, this isn't black people rising up, this is a few troublemakers and so on, and that's really nothing to do with the civil rights. So one of the things that always remember, and this is true today, is that you might even ask yourself again, why does Obama allow a investigation to go on of people that are fairly liberal and labor activists and anti-war activists and Palestine activists? Well, you got to look at, okay, what's the benefit from that? And so we'll talk about that again. If you move a little further back to the Black liberation movement, and again, this is you're getting in the late 60s, early 70s. That's when you had the COINTELPRO program, counterintelligence program, the FBI, and they had a file that they called Black nationalist hate groups that they were going to target, a bunch of FBI agents and so on. Well, who was on that list? Okay, Nation of Islam, Congress of Racial Equality, the NAACP, any group that was fighting racism whatsoever. So they certainly focused on that. It didn't really matter whether they were an actual threat to the country, but according to them they were. But many people also know about, obviously, the Black Panther Party that the FBI targeted. I mean, they went on a campaign to wipe them out, to assassinate them. And one of the things that, it doesn't come out that much, but the Black Panther Party at the time was trying to form alliances with other organizations. Like some of the, and I forget their name at the moment, but some of the very radical black trade union organizations in my hometown in Detroit would have been a good example. You probably remember who that was, but I can't remember their name.
League of Revolutionary Black Workers.
Could have been. Yeah, so they were trying to form alliances with people like them. They were trying to form alliances with the anti-war movement like SDS. So what did the FBI do? They would send out offensive racist cartoons, written by, well, these came from the SDS. And one of the other things for you folks that were here in Chicago, you probably remember that at that time there was a movement to politicize the gangs in Chicago. And Jeff Fort was the president, the leader of the Blackstone Rangers at the time, and the Black Panther Party in Chicago was working on an alliance with the Blackstone Rangers and with Jeff Fort. What do you think the FBI did? They suggested some messages to Jeff Fort that, in pretending they were Black Panther Party members from Chicago, saying, what they're really all about is they really want to assassinate you. They don't want an alliance. They just want to get rid of you. Okay, that whole solidarity attempt down the tubes. So again, one of the things to remember is that at that time, the FBI was targeting a whole group of people. Obviously, any black or African American people in the country. And again, the last thing they wanted to see was them in any kind of solidarity with a labor union, a trade union, an anti-war group, or anything like that. Well, if you move a little bit ahead in history, there's a movement that we don't talk a lot about, the American Indian movement, who was very active in the late 60s, early 70s, modeled on the Black Panther Party. And they were another movement that the FBI absolutely wanted to wipe out. One of my favorite quotes, and I think this kind of says it all, there was this is Norman Zergrassi. He was one of the heads of the Rapid City office around where the Pine Ridge Reservation was, where there's a big standoff between FBI people and AIM members and so on. So he said, well, they, the Indians, are a conquered nation, and when you are conquered, the people you are conquered by dictate your future. This is a basic philosophy of mine. If I'm part of the conquered nation, I've got to yield authority. The FBI must function as a colonial police force. Well, they absolutely functioned as a colonial police force, and there were over 69 AIM members and their supporters who were murdered, not only by the FBI, but also by their supporters within, in this case, the Oglala tribe that sided with the FBI. Again, another example of certainly an oppressed people within the United States. AIM members also tried to do solidarity with other groups and so on. No, we're not gonna let that happen. So we're going to speed ahead a little bit to the 80s. And this is a movement that has a lot of similarities to what's, I think, happening now, and we'll be interested to get your thoughts on this. This is a sanctuary and Latin American solidarity movement. Everybody remembers Reagan and his focus on, he wasn't really focused on the evil empire in Russia and all that kind of stuff. What he really was focused on is destroying revolutionary movements in Latin America. During that time, there were over 200 groups who were spied on, investigated, I like to call they're messed with. They would go out to your financial supporters and say, oh, you don't want to give money to these organizations. They're supporting terrorism. And this is one of the first times you hear the FBI talking about supporting a foreign terrorist organization. Came up during this period. So what were some of these groups? Well, AIM was part of it. There was the Maryknoll Sisters. There was the U.S. Catholic Laity Concerned. There was a Marxist-Leninist party. There was the Muslim Students of America, a large number of religious groups, and so on. Very broad movement. So what can we say about that? Well, one of the things that, again, the FBI and the Justice Department doesn't want is any kind of solidarity with organizations like that. You certainly don't want to get church groups and like Amnesty International and Marxist groups, and you don't want that kind of solidarity, particularly focusing on one of the pillars of your particular foreign policy to destroy those revolutions in South America. The last example I'm going to give is the Puerto Rican independence movement. That again was the 70s and again into the 80s. And you certainly can see a focus again on a colonial occupied people, a focus on American foreign policy, and you certainly can see that the FBI was certainly wanted nothing to do with people in Puerto Rico, which is just like Cuba, just right off our coast, actually asking for independence. So there were hundreds and hundreds of files of Puerto Rican activists. You might remember in then 85, there was actually what I would call an invasion of the island. FBI people, military people from the base on Puerto Rico went all through Puerto Rico, invading homes, arresting hundreds of Puerto Rican activists. And one of the other things that's important about the Puerto Rican independence movement and the attempt to crush it, it's one of the first times that you see widespread use of the grand jury as a mechanism to destroy a movement. That happened before, with SDS and even Bernardine Dorn and other people, but this is the first time it was used on a very broad level. So there were 20 different grand juries that were going on at that time. 7,200 Puerto Rican activists were subpoenaed in front of grand juries, and of course, to do what? To testify against their friends, against their comrades, well, either here or in Puerto Rico. All refused. Many of them went to jail from like 4 months to some, 2, 3, 4 years. Okay. So if you go through that history, one of the things that I'm kind of leading to is, what kind of conclusions can you make? And again, why now is the FBI and the U.S. Justice Department focused on this a collection of anti-war, labor activists, solidarity activists with Colombia, and now particularly Palestine? Why is this happening? Well, one of the things from my short little history, and during the question and answer, there'll be 20 million other things that I, of course, left out in this quick run-through. But certainly one of the things that's happening now is if you look at a focus on what's the center point of U.S. foreign policy right now, and the most concern, and you might say, well, Afghanistan, well, I don't know. One of the big focuses of U.S. foreign policy is the Middle East, and certainly is Israel and Palestine. And of course, it doesn't matter that Obama is president or Bush was president or whatever. And if you look at the FBI history, one of the things that they cannot tolerate is any organizations here in this country that might, in a very organized, popular, and growing, increasingly popular movement, support what they see as foreign terrorists, in particular, or foreign terrorist organization. The other thing that's happening right now, too, is that there's a lot of focus of the FBI on a very large group of people, similar to the Black Menace during the Civil Rights Movement, or the Black Nationalist Movement, or the American Indian Movement, or the Palestinian, or the Puerto Rican Independence Movement. It's really Arabs and Muslims. Okay, it doesn't matter. They think all Arabs are Muslims, and all of them together are terrorists, and so on. So you have a very, very broad brush right now. And that's also fairly common if you look at this history. They will target a very large group of people, but if some organizations or a movement is becoming popular within that, that target, they're going to stop that. And they're going to want to stop as much solidarity movements as possible. One of the things that's grown incredibly over the last 2 or 3 years is the Boycott, Divestment, Sanction movement against Israel. It was always very big in Europe. It's huge here in the United States now, and growing daily. If you look at the largest student groups in the United States on college campuses, the most active ones, they're the Students for Justice for Palestine. You would think they would be anti-war, and they're not. You could talk about whether that's a good thing or not, but so again, this is a movement that's becoming very popular, and the FBI doesn't want to do anything other than to crush it and prevent it from becoming more popular, establishing solidarity ties to other organizations, to labor unions, to religious organizations, and so on. So I'm going to stop there so Joe can talk a little bit about, more than a little, about the current investigation that's going on. And then during the question and answer period, we can talk a little bit more about why this is happening now and connect those dots.
Thank you, Bill. Is this thing? Yeah, it's live. Good afternoon. I want to begin by thanking the Open University of the Left for the invitation to speak today. And I'll just say, by way of further introduction of myself, I think most people who know me as a trade union activist. As Robert said, I'm a clerical worker at the university. I'm the chief steward for 1,500 clerical workers in SEIU Local 73. I'm also, this last year, for a year and a half, I chaired the 3 bargaining unit committee for 3,000 workers at UIC as we went through our contract negotiations, which resulted last summer in 2 strike deadlines, and I'm also on the executive board of the local. It's a 25,000 member public sector union. My wife Stephanie Weiner, and I have also been anti-war activists for probably the single largest thing I ever worked on in the anti-war movement was when the Republican National Convention was held in St. Paul in the summer of 2008. I was the bus coordinator for Chicago. And my wife is a member of the same organization that Bill's a member of, the Palestine Solidarity Group. So that's a little more about who we are. And as far as our recent bout with the FBI, I don't know, I guess maybe the way to introduce this is, I don't know how many of you saw the recently canceled Glenn Beck show episode where he spent 13 minutes attacking those of us who had been raided by the FBI and subpoenaed to the grand jury. That was just last month. I don't know, one of my son's friends said, well, if you've been attacked by Glenn Beck, you must be doing something right. I want to briefly recount the developments in our case and then talk about some of the issues around them. So, September 24th, 7 homes and an anti-war office were raided here and in the Twin Cities and in Grand Rapids. 14 people and several anti-war organizations were subpoenaed to a grand jury. The warrants and the subpoenas were investigating allegations of a conspiracy to provide material support for foreign terrorist organizations. Then in December, 9 more people, mostly young people, mostly Palestinian Americans, were subpoenaed to the same grand jury. Each of the 23 of us reached the conclusion that solidarity meant that we would refuse to participate in the grand jury, that we would refuse to talk. Another reference from popular culture, 2 weeks ago, there's a TV show that's set in Chicago called The Good Wife. Anybody watch that? 2 weeks ago, a character in the show received, she remarked, the head of the law firm remarked, when one of her staff was subpoenaed to a grand jury in Chicago, the lead character said, quote, a Chicago grand jury will indict a ham sandwich. And we came to understand that the grand jury was in fact an undemocratic prosecutorial tool, and we had no intention of any of us participating in it. One of the consequences for each of us in our decisions to resist is the U.S. Attorney, Pat Fitzgerald, and all U.S. attorneys have a practice of imposing something called use immunity in grand juries. What that means is you cannot refuse to answer questions. If you refuse, you are then in contempt of court, and you can be jailed for the life of the grand jury, despite having no evidence to be able to even produce an indictment, to bring charges against you. They can, and grand juries, by the way, seat for 18 months. So any one of us, by refusing to testify, faces that possible consequence. So about our case further, you need to know that the repression against us began with that organizing for the Republican National Convention in the summer of 2008. The FBI sent a, what they refer to as a law enforcement agent, Officer Karen Sullivan, the name she went by, to infiltrate the coalition, to march on the RNC and stop the war. That coalition, which we were members of here as well, had the permit for the permitted protest for the first day of the Republican Convention, Labor Day, September 1st. So Officer Sullivan showed up in the coalition meetings in the Twin Cities in April of 2008 and became a very dedicated activist, became a core activist in organizing that protest. And then apparently finding nothing to justify her paycheck during the course of the protests, decided to stick around for 2 more years. And in the course of it, causing harm to the movement and laying the groundwork for provocations and eventually the case against us. And I'll come back to that as well. The last bit of just update is the FBI has continued to visit activists up until February. And more recently, in conversations with our attorneys, again, none of the people subpoenaed have spoken to the U.S. Attorney, but in the conversations with our attorneys, the U.S. Attorney has indicated strongly that their intentions include multiple indictments, 6, 7, 8 people being indicted on these charges. Pat Fitzgerald intends on having a trial of terrorist-loving Americans and prison sentences. And just so you know, the charges of providing material support for foreign terrorist organizations carry up to 15 years in prison. So, in addition to the possibility of contempt citations and jail time for non-cooperation. And finally, the evidence against us, it overwhelmingly comes from this paid professional liar, Officer Sullivan, who infiltrated the organizations in the Twin Cities. So I'll talk a little more about the probable legal basis of the charges, the recent Supreme Court decision, Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project, it's called, and solidarity work with Palestine and Colombia. So just a little more about the scope of our case. Noam Chomsky said last month on Democracy Now! That about the attack on us and the Supreme Court decision, Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project. He said, quote, "This is the worst attack on freedom of speech since the Smith Act 70 years ago." And Michael Deutsch, who's one of our attorneys and is a member of the People's Law Office, who's been fighting against the abuse of the grand jury system for 4 decades, he said that ours is the most sweeping grand jury investigation aimed at political activists in his 40 years of legal work. So Bill's already detailed the FBI's long history and recent history of attacks on political speech and association, but I just want to talk about this Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project because there's a new quality here. For people who haven't read about it, this is a court case that began 12 years ago when an organization that was trying to counsel revolutionary organizations in Kurdistan and in Sri Lanka to abandon armed struggle and go towards using peaceful means to resolve their grievances with their regimes. Under the 1996 Effective Death Penalty and Foreign Terrorist Act, even before the Patriot Act, there was the U.S. The State Department and the FBI was saying that those activities were themselves providing material support for foreign terrorist organizations. And lower courts found on behalf of this Humanitarian Law Project, and the U.S. government appealed it and appealed it and appealed it, and it finally ended up in the Supreme Court this last year when Eric Holder, who is Barack Obama's Attorney General, sent Elena Kagan as the prosecutor in to argue and win this case that for the first time ever has put forward this completely new notion that political speech itself may not be protected by the First Amendment and can be construed as material support for foreign terrorist organizations. This is an escalation, to say the least, on the attack on democratic rights in this country. So I want to talk a little bit about the relationship between anti-war and international solidarity work. So the FBI and the U.S. Attorney are attacking the anti-war movement. That is how this investigation began. Every protest that has gone on in this country since, actually before 9/11, every national protest of any consequence, the U.S. government terms a national security event. They spy on them. There's a lot of documentation that the Department of Justice has released themselves about the FBI spying on every matter of peace organization. Just in September, just before we were raided, this report was released. But within the anti-war movement, now and forever, there's always been an element of people and an element of solidarity work, a current. During the wars in Central America, there was a very vibrant Central America solidarity movement. Even during the sanctions against Iraq in the 1990s, there were people who traveled to Iraq and tried to break the sanctions. Kathy Kelly from Chicago and others to bring material aid to those people. So what is international solidarity work? Mainly, what it means is political and humanitarian aid, and really both of which should be protected by the Constitution and by and they are protected by international law. People take trips, they call for freedom of political prisoners, they publish the views of people resisting imperialism, and sometimes they send token contributions to people's movement organizations, like, for example, the women's committees of Palestine. This is the same sort of work that was done to support the anti-apartheid movement in the 1980s. You know, for example, when we called for the release of Nelson Mandela, who, by the way, the State Department considered him and his organization, the African National Congress, a terrorist organization until, what year? Can anyone guess what year did the ANC get taken off the foreign terrorist organization list?
2001. 94.
Later.
2004.
Later.
Not yesterday.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I thought you said 2004. 2008.
Wow.
And interestingly enough, President Barack Obama wrote the foreword to Nelson Mandela's recently republished autobiography, which was released in 2010. Had he written it 2 years earlier, and Holder versus Humanitarian Law had been in place at the time, he could have been accused of violation of material support for a foreign terrorist organization. So, anyway, going back to our situation, you know, it has become apparent again from our lawyers talking with with Fitzgerald's office that Fitzgerald is very upset about small amounts of money of assistance for the daycare and the women's center projects of the Union of Palestine Women's Committees. The Palestine Solidarity Group that Bill's a member of, my wife's a member of, when they send delegations, human rights delegations to the West Bank, and previously when it was possible to go to Gaza, it was the women's committees that would host them, that would provide them with translators, transportation, that would take them to meet, take them to places, would provide, food, places to stay, and the money that was given to them, this is what they are looking at and considering as material support for foreign terrorist organizations. The Union is a progressive women's organization that strives to build a civil, democratic, progressive community that respects women's rights as part of human rights in general. So, I just have another quote here from the Center for Constitutional Rights said, not just talking about this recent Supreme Court decision, but the language in the Patriot Act and in the Effective Death Penalty Act. They said, these material support provisions violate the First Amendment as they criminalize activities like distribution of literature, engaging in political advocacy, participating in peace conferences, training in human rights advocacy, and donating cash and humanitarian assistance, even when this type of support is intended only to promote lawful and nonviolent activities.
Excuse me, who said that?
The Center for Constitutional Rights. They actually argued the case Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project in front of the Supreme Court. So the point is that these laws have a chilling effect on civil liberties and humanitarian and domestic political organizing, and particularly, as Bill said, amongst the Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim communities. So, why are they focusing so much on the Palestinian community? The U.S. government needs to put a local face on the enemy. At the time we were raided, they had 2 wars against Muslim nations. Now they have a 3rd. Their goal in doing this is to criminalize anti-war activism and international solidarity activism in defense of their foreign policy, which has resulted in the deaths of thousands of men and women from this country and hundreds of thousands of Iraqis and Afghans. So I want to say one last thing, or one last point about the professional liar and the practice of federal law enforcement spying and infiltration. I met Officer Sullivan on several occasions. She's been in my house, and I have to, it is the fact that she lied to me. She lied to everyone that was at those meetings that I was at. And she lied to everyone that she worked with in the anti-war movement and solidarity movement for 2.5 years. And when Pat Fitzgerald brings us to court, she will lie in court. And furthermore, she also took part in the what people have referred to as provocateur activities, classic disruption. In the summer of 2009, she disrupted and caused to be canceled a solidarity delegation to Palestine, and that same summer she disrupted a labor fight that was going on in the Quad Cities. People remember after Republic Windows and Doors here in Chicago, the next summer, the United Electrical Workers had another fight at a small factory in Rock Island. And the workers at this little factory had moved to the point of having a civil disobedience action in front of a Wells Fargo bank. And those of us who went there suddenly discovered that the local police were all in an uproar because the FBI had called them and told them that dangerous people were coming to the protest to start a riot. So it was just bizarre to us at the time, and now in hindsight, this was the work of Officer Sullivan. So what are we expecting? We're expecting in the next weeks or month that the U.S. attorneys will either bring us more subpoenas, they will hit us with contempt charges and jail us for refusing to testify, or they will bring indictments. And it is going to be ugly. You know, when we have statements, when we have protests, when we do something, we get ignored by the mass media. When Pat Fitzgerald brings his indictments of these, and you know what his attorneys have said to our attorneys about us? He said these people are dangerous Marxists.
Is there any other kind?
That's what he said about the Freedom Road Socialist Organization and the International Solidarity Activists. And I just want to say one more thing, which is that the warrants and the investigation focus on two organizations, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. Those are the two organizations that they were most interested in, and since then it's really become focused on the Popular Front. And I think if we step back from it, we can see that clearly the designation of foreign terrorist organization by the State Department is politically driven, having nothing to do with a threat to the United States. Nelson Mandela and the ANC, that just shocks people when they hear about that. So many of the people who were subpoenaed, many of the people who were raided and subpoenaed are members of Freedom Road, and it is clear, I don't know if anybody has had a chance to online, you can see one of our warrants is posted on the internet. It is clear that they intend to destroy our organization. They are treating us like a criminal enterprise. And who are we really? You know, we're a group of people who are very dedicated to the mass movements that we are involved in. If you don't know any of us, ask somebody who's worked with us and they'll tell you. We principally build mass movements and we cherish and nurture mass organizations. We are not a separate, an organization that's separate from the mass movement or apart from it. In fact, we have a website, www.frso.org. And on the 1st of May, like all socialists, we're having an event. And you're all welcome to come to it. It's at 4 o'clock at the Casa Michoacan in Pilsen. So anyway, in closing, what's really dangerous here is the new type of McCarthyism, the war on terrorism and the enemy within, and we are the guinea pigs for this escalation. And so we have one thing that we'd like to ask of you, and I asked the organizers for permission to do this, and Libby's got another clipboard. We have a pledge of resistance. We anticipate, as I said, being indicted or jailed sometime in the weeks to come, and we are asking everyone to make a pledge that when the announcement comes that we have been indicted or that we've been re-subpoenaed, we will call emergency protests at the Federal Building here in Chicago, which is where this grand jury meets. And we're asking our friends and our fellow activists to pledge to show up for those protests. And it's being circulated nationally, but it's especially important here. So please sign up, and thank you for your time. And oh, one last thing. If the FBI comes to your house, don't talk to them. Thank you.
Microphone's open.
Actually, I was going to make one last comment that Joe didn't bring up, but one of the things, I think it's up to probably almost 300 organizations right now that have issued support statements for all the folks like Joe and Stephanie and all the 23 that have been subpoenaed. And those are church groups, they're labor unions. Very proud to say my daughter's on the executive board of the Chicago Teachers Union, passed a support statement to support the 23 people that have been subpoenaed. So just remember though, as I said, from history, the FBI and Justice Department does not like solidarity between organizations. And this has been one of the great examples of that. So they're going to fight back.
This is just an information point. Where are you announcing like updates on the case on this FRSO.org?
Oh, no, the campaign, not everybody who's been subpoenaed or who was raided is in Freedom Road. We have a website, stopfbi.net. Yeah, it's got tons of statements from, like Bill said, hundreds of organizations, and every bit of press we've got, it's published there. But there's an email list, and announcements come out pretty regularly. In fact, there's going to be one coming out today. We just received another letter from a U.S. congressman in North Carolina that he sent to Attorney General Holder challenging the repression of us. So it's we have a mounting campaign to get more legislators to speak on our behalf.
How many do you have so far?
We have 3 letters that we've gleaned, but we're starting to get traction. 2 of them have come in the last month. We got one from Danny Davis here in Chicago, and then one from this Representative Price in North Carolina, and earlier Keith Ellison in the Twin Cities had written one.
Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Margaret. Is that on?
Yeah.
Yeah, could you make sure that's on? The
There's
microphone.
a switch on top.
Oh.
There you go.
Could you comment or compare this type of activity under the George W. Bush administration and the Obama administration?
Yeah, I can take it from the attack on the Palestine solidarity movement. Under the Bush administration, and of course you know that he was no supporter of a free Palestine. And he was also obviously under the Patriot Act and was very active in cases against actually Palestinian Americans that were active obviously in supporting the Palestinian liberation movement. And I think it goes back to the point Joe made. They so much wanted to put some local face on terrorism. Well, there even locally, there's Dr. Sami El-Arian, Dr. Eshkar, and Mohammed Salah are cases that started during the Bush administration. These are Palestinians, people who were Palestinian activists, who were charged by people like Ashcroft, is the same thing they're saying about you. You know, these are very dangerous people. Unfortunately for them, most of the trials, and these were trials for giving material support for terrorism, when they went through the court system, they were thrown out. You know, people didn't believe the evidence, and you know they had Israeli security officials talking about evidence of like confessions and all this kind of thing. Even with that, the cases were thrown out. Do you think those people are free? None of them are free, and actually they're all still in jail. Why? Because they went in front of a grand jury and Bush would not let them go and wanted them to talk about their friends here, their comrades and supporters in the United States and in Palestine, and of course they refused. How does that compare to under Obama? You think Obama and Eric Holder are doing anything about these cases? One of the folks, I think it's Dr. Ashgar, he's in jail for 11 years for contempt of court. He served about 2 or 3 years. You think the Obama administration is doing much about it? Not at all. And I think the fact that what Joe was talking about a few minutes ago, Eric Holder has been no different than Ashcroft under Bush. I mean, he's, we talk about how Obama hasn't mentioned the war on terrorism. BS, he hasn't. He's still going after people he considers terrorists and people here who he thinks and his administration thinks support foreign terrorist organizations, and this is a great example.
Hi, I just wondered, once you're informed you're an object of grand jury investigation, I imagine you can't travel very much. I imagine you're under legal travel restrictions. I just wondered what other onerous terms they put on you for the term of the grand jury. Let's say they're not finding you doing anything wrong, but just because you're an object of the grand jury investigation, what can they do to you to make life miserable for you? Thank you.
All right. Well, I didn't start with the the graphic details, but on the morning of the 24th of September, my home was raided by the FBI. In the course of, they showed up at 7 in the morning. The last FBI agents didn't leave until 6:30 in the afternoon. They came in with 15 or 16 agents, and then at lunch, some of them left, and some more came. So by the end of the day, there were 25 agents that searched our home for 12 hours. They took every financial document that they cared to. They took our bank statements. They copied our hard drives. They didn't actually seize our computers. They copied them. And they seized our passports. We had a box where, we're a family, we got 2 kids. They took a box with all of our most important documents: the deed to our house, the titles to our cars, our kids' social security cards. They've taken them all, and they have refused to return any of them. So all of the people who were raided, they're not going anywhere. We've attempted to get new passports, and we have been essentially told, forget about it. So, so for now, I think those are the most important consequences.
Joe, you don't look like a ham sandwich. Good luck.
Thank you.
I have kind of an arcane question. Back in the 60s, Robert F. Kennedy went after the mob. How does this tie in, or does it tie in, with what they were doing about terrorism and political repression?
I think the only comment I could make about that is, of course, that was when J. Edgar Hoover was head of the FBI. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the things the FBI was supposed to be doing was going after organized crime. Well, notoriously, that's the last thing that J. Edgar Hoover wanted to focus on. And he clearly was focused on, commies and any of all the, social repression of the social movements. That was his thing. So, of course, when, RFK kind of decided that, this is a period of time when organized crime was building and becoming very powerful. RFK decided to kind of take that on himself and do some of that work, because the people that were supposed to be focusing on organized crime weren't. It's like the one real quick example. It's like Martin Luther King has a famous letter he wrote to J. Edgar Hoover and said, don't you think you should be spending a little bit more time investigating those children that were burned in a church, in the South, instead of spending all your time focusing on me and our movement? Well, yeah, exactly.
I just wanted to ask if the ACLU gotten involved in your case at all, or that they said anything about it?
Yes, the ACLU has been involved. Our legal team is primarily made up of members of the National Lawyers Guild and here in Chicago, the People's Law Office. And actually, just ironically, the morning we were raided, the National Lawyers Guild National Convention was taking place in New Orleans. And we tried to call every lawyer we knew, and none of them would answer their phones because they were all in New Orleans in this convention. Actually, we finally reached Libby's husband, Jeff. He was the first one to answer his phone. And actually, the afternoon before the raids, they had a very large workshop, one of the most important workshops at the convention, discussing Holder versus the Humanitarian Law Project and its possible consequences for civil liberties. And then they had a test pilot project during the course of their workshop. The ACLU has come in a number of ways. We do have, we have just an enormous legal team. Everyone so far has worked pro bono, and the ACLU has been part of that. In addition, the ACLU's National Policy Office has been really tremendous. This guy, Mike German, who is a former FBI agent whose specialty as an FBI agent was investigating domestic supporters of foreign terrorist organizations. And, he's just been invaluable to us because he's looked at our entire case. He's looked at the subpoenas, he's looked at the warrants, and he said there is little or no evidence that they have anything on us that is criminal in nature. He said everything they're talking about, everything they're looking for is associational in nature. So, the ACLU, carries that kind of status. So when we've been to Washington to meet with legislators, or when we've met with our legislators locally, we keep saying, you don't believe us? Go talk to the ACLU. Talk to Mike German. And it's had a tremendous effect on them. So, yeah, the ACLU has been really important.
Must have scared us off.
I'm curious, just as a thought experiment, is former President Carter vulnerable under the Holder versus Humanitarian decision?
Absolutely. Yeah, so...
Well, I hope they get him.
Yeah, well, he was involved in meeting with the various groups in Lebanon, including Hezbollah, during the elections there. He was involved in the elections in Palestine between Fatah and Hamas. Absolutely, he's but I don't think they're going to do anything.
One of the things that I just can't get my arms around with all of this is, and maybe you've probably done a lot of thinking about this, but what exactly do you think is their political calculation here? Now, the reason I raise that question is, their timing, if anything, I'm speaking about the federal government right now, and specifically the Obama administration, seems exquisitely bad to me, insofar as, look what happened last November. What does this mean to their, quote, liberal base? I have to believe that a lot of people are extremely turned off about what's going on with you right now and this, witch hunt, whatever you want to call this. But I'd just like you to maybe expand on that, if possible.
Well, I think that I don't know the proportion to which our case is hurting Obama. I know that the launching of a third war, the intensification of the war in Afghanistan. I think for most anti-war people, for most leftists, I think that those kind of sealed the judgment of Obama. What I had thought, and what Freedom Road had thought at the time of his election was that he would, on foreign policy matters, he would mainly represent continuity with the Bush administration, and I think that's still an accurate assessment. But the perception of what a difference it was going to make to have this centrist, Democrat, constitutional scholar, African-American politician in the White House, the perception of it, I think, has been shattered at this point. And for me, it was best captured when we went in November to meet with Jan Schakowsky. Now, Jan and we do not have the same views on the Middle East at all. But Jan, number one, had been in an Alinsky group in the 70s that was infiltrated by the Chicago Red Squad. And number two, her husband was subpoenaed to a grand jury for check kiting about 10 years ago. And so she actually was one of the most effusive in her sympathy for us. So far she hasn't written a letter, but we're meeting with her again on Wednesday. But what she said to us as we were leaving, I mean, I don't think she planned this. She said, if this had happened under Bush, there would have been an outcry from the liberals in Congress. She said, where is everybody? And we were standing there looking at her going, yeah!
There we are.
And anyway, she's actually been, relatively speaking, her staff has been the most accessible. They have been, nice to us. It's just getting them to move and do something public has been frustratingly slow. But and I don't care if this comes out, because by Wednesday, hopefully, we'll have the letter from her.
Yeah, then maybe I'll make a quick comment. Since you mentioned the Red Squad, to kind of tie, the history I was talking about to now. Well, everybody knows about the Red Squad. Well, now it's the counterterrorism centers. You've probably heard about that. That's the local law enforcement cooperation with the FBI and the Justice Department and the military intelligence and all of those groups that used to do the same thing for the Red Squad. Now it's called, every city has a counterintelligence center. So these are, if you looked at the Obama administration, again, it's still continuing the war on terror. And it's still targeting, the same kind of groups that the Red Squad did way back a long time ago. But then, the name's different. And I think the other thing in the end is, I don't know, I'll say a couple of things. I don't know that the Obama administration really is that threatened by folks like us in the room that, well, gee, maybe we might not vote for him next time. I think he figures that, our votes are pretty much lost. But I do think it's very interesting that I think Obama and Holder and Fitzgerald really miscalculated. I really think they thought they were going to, break into your house in the first group of 14, and then December another group of 9, and everybody would fold, and Fitzgerald would have a great, another terrorism case he could bring to the American public. Gee, I wonder why he hasn't done that for, what is it? It's April now.
6 months.
So I think there is an impact of all the groups and people like us that have come out and supported the 23 people and the protests and the people calling their office. Will that stop them from indicting people? Maybe not, but it's built a group of solidarity folks here that are absolutely going to be out there if that happens.
This has to do with the solidarity issue. Manning Mirable recently wrote a biography of Malcolm X, and in it he insinuates that the FBI was very much in on the plot to assassinate Malcolm X. In fact, Willie Manning got off scot-free. He was the finger man, and later used by the mayor of New Jersey in his campaign. He's in the Sports Hall of Fame, New Jersey. Do you have any evidence of this? Manning seemed to think that it was not a smoking gun, but it's pretty pretty certain that they were in on it. There was a run-through of the hall the evening before, and some have said that FBI agents were part of that, going through the hall. Any comments?
Yeah, I'm waiting to read that biography, but no, I haven't actually heard that. The only comment I would make is it certainly would be very consistent with the FBI modus of operandi at that time. I mean, you could look at people like Fred Hampton here in Chicago. I mean, the FBI informant was his director of security. He was one of the top people in the Chicago chapter of the Black Panther Party. So there certainly were known for doing that and literally setting people up to be assassinated. So it would be consistent, but that's the only comment I could make.
I just wanted to say, first of all, that though we've not met, you have a lot of people's support. You really do.
Thank you.
A lot of people know about this, and anyway. After the last OUL meeting I came to, I went to a Jane Addams unemployment march reenactment, and I learned something that probably most of you already know, because you're more historically knowledgeable than I am. But that is that Jane Addams was thought of as one of the absolute most dangerous people in this country. So I just wanted to bring that up and tell you that you are in very good company. It doesn't make it any better, but anyway.
Thank you very much. Actually, on Monday, people know at UIC is where the Jane Addams Hull House Museum is established. And on Monday, after for 6 months, nobody at UIC wanted to acknowledge that I was a target of this investigation. But the Jane Addams Hull House Museum is sponsoring a talk by myself and Maureen Murphy and Ben Meyer, one of our legal team, about the case. And Lisa Lee, the executive director, is going to introduce us and MC the program and give a talk about Jane Addams' commitment to civil liberties. And I can tell you that the university administration was a little nervous about Lisa doing that and Jane Addams sponsoring the event. Just more than a little nervous. But I mean, UIC, there's this weird thing that's gone on culturally because of in that Glenn Beck episode. I mean, this is just effluvia, but in that Glenn Beck episode, Glenn Beck, when he talked about me, he turned to the camera and he said, "This is Joe Iosbaker. He's an SEIU activist. And where does he work? UIC." And he raised his eyebrows, and I could see all of his minions going, "Bill Ayers, UIC, it must be some kind of terrorist haven."
Geez, these days I could see Roosevelt, but not UIC.
Anyway.
Well, speaking of UIC, there was the Students for Justice in Palestine group there had a cafe intifada, which they've had a number of times on Thursday. Performers and spoken word, different things supporting Palestine, of course. Well, they had all kinds of the administration got a lot of complaints because it was called the cafe intifada. That's encouraging violence. It's like we kind of looked around and went, "Isn't it intifada, which means uprising in Arabic?"
Are you talking about Cafe Binjan?
No.
This
It's
is
called,
something
it's just the
else.
Students for Justice in Palestine.
Uh,
So everything that's happening across the Arab world right now is an intifada, which Obama, well, he's trying to figure out what he's going to support or what he isn't. But yeah, they got lots of complaints. Oh, that's encouraging violence. You can't call it that. Yeah.
Isn't our State Department providing material support by extending money to the West Bank?
This material support law language is obviously just enormously political. There are other examples. The Attorney General, Eric Holder, was the lawyer for the Chiquita Corporation. And he defended Chiquita in a case brought against Chiquita by the unions in Colombia, where Chiquita had for 3 years paid a total of $2.5 million to the paramilitary organization whose initials are AUL. I can't remember what the English language translation is. Chiquita provided them $2.5 million in money and weapons. And this is an organization on the U.S. State Department list of foreign terrorist organizations. Eric Holder is guilty, really, actually guilty of this, providing weapons and money to a foreign terrorist organization. So it's political. It's about, the wars they like and the wars they don't like.
Could we raid his house?
We could be like Barney and do a citizen's arrest.
More effective than Barney.
Does your legal team, their opinion on the way they're proceeding, is there any, I don't know how to say this, but are they aware of the incompetency of the FBI? Do they win any? I know they make a lot of smoke.
Well, in fact, Bill was talking about Pat Fitzgerald's track record in the U.S. Attorney here, his track record with these previous cases of material support for foreign terrorist organizations, all of whom have been Palestinian Americans. And yeah, Pat Fitzgerald has failed to get a single conviction in front of an actual court of Americans because it comes down to convicting people for their ideas. And as right-wing as the American people are, and as confused as they are in when they're asked questions by Fox News pundits or people doing surveys, if you present them with the arguments and present them with the facts, they don't support putting people in prison for their ideas. And part of me wants to get in front of an actual jury of my peers, because they'll never convict me or my wife or any of us, because we're not guilty of this. But I think that, the larger picture is, why do they do this? We were talking about this before the program. Why did why did so many people, what happened to all the people who were targeted in McCarthyism? How many of them actually went to prison? A few score? 100, 200 maybe? But tens of thousands of people's lives were destroyed. They didn't have to be convicted. They didn't have to go to prison. Their companies fired them. Their unions expelled them. Their neighbors spit on them. That's what they want to happen to us, and that's why you're so important. Because this is what's going to happen. When they indict us, every newspaper in town, maybe every newspaper in the country, is going to have screaming headlines about the dangerous Marxists, who support these foreign terrorist organizations. And, if you go to our website, we're guilty of, having some pretty outrageous rhetoric on some occasions. Yeah, we've supported national liberation movements. What left group in this country hasn't? But they're going to take that, they're going to tie it together with, something that this cop, may have recorded us saying. She might have recordings from my kitchen. We drank together a lot. I might have a drunken rambling, on one of her recordings, saying something that they can, weave together with, with our public statements and this little bit of money, whatever. When Pat Fitzgerald brings it, most people in this country who hear it are going to say, wow, there are terrorist supporters in America. And people like you have to turn to them and say, that's not true. I know these people. I've met these people. Or, look at the logic of it. It's really going to take, there's going to be like a blast wave when this hits. And most people, even most liberals, even a lot of people who adopted resolutions or signed our petitions are going to be blown away. And it's going to take, the Open University of the left, because you all have been standing up to, right-wing ideology and imperialist bullshit for many years. You're going to have to stand up and say, that's not true. And I know it. And we're really counting on you. Thank you.
Any more questions? Okay, well that's it, I guess. Thank you very much.